All right, ladies and gentlemen, just 1 minute, and then it's 10 after, so please, those that are standing, take a seat, and we'll start the program. Actually, while I'm doing that, let me introduce myself. I'm Brian Mooney. I'm principal of Rick Engineering Company, also a senior vice president, overseeing the planning program for all of our offices. And with me tonight is Shannon Baer.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. There's still some stragglers coming in, but we really appreciate you guys coming tonight and bearing the heat.
And another quick notice, I know most of you have already been here, but the bathrooms are in the back, straight back. So ultimately, that's always a key part to start, and we do have some refreshments for those of you that haven't seen it on the back table for water. So let's start this presentation, and I'm going to go through really the agenda first for tonight. We have a 25-minute presentation to start, really to orient you to really what we've been doing in developing a land use plan for Lithium Valley. And ultimately, we're going to talk about that. Then we're going to stop and take some questions about the presentation that we made. And then we're going to move to the open house, which goes to a series of stations. Each station will have 2 individuals. We'll have a Spanish speaker at each station. However, we also will have people that are specializing in some of the areas that we're discussing. So some of the items you see in here may be very quick to come across. Going to the station gives you a chance to really look at the issue in depth. What do we mean by land use? What are the land uses? What kind of development is going to happen? So that's an extremely important part of the overall presentation. I always like to stop and just say, can you hear me in the back? Excellent. That's what we like to know. The next aspect I want to just touch base on is how we've got here and what we're doing. Our client is the County of Imperial. And then the team is the Rick Planning and Design Division of Rick Engineering, doing the master plan, really developing the land use plan and also coordinating the outreach program to make sure the land use plan is built on community interests. We then are working in association with DUDEC. DUDEC is the environmental consultant that once we create a plan, will do an environmental analysis of the plan to examine what are the environmental impacts, how does it affect both the environment and the community. So that's another phase, and we'll talk more about that. We also want to recognize a couple of our sub-consultants that aren't here in relationship to Diego Lasco, City Thinkers. We're going to have an urban design element to this so that we really look at the kind of architecture, the kind of layout that goes into future developments on the overall project. And then what we've been doing is we did a baseline study. From that baseline study and everybody's input, we developed land use alternatives. Tonight, we're going to talk about those land use alternatives and some of the ideas we've come up with over the last 6 to 7 months. Now, this is a great one. What have we accomplished? And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Shannon, who's accomplished most of it.
Thanks. So the last time we had a community workshop was, I believe, back in January. So it's been 7 months or so. So I wanted to catch you all up on what we've been doing and what we've accomplished thus far. So we've had that community workshop in Calipatria, as maybe you guys attended. We've compiled that community feedback that we got at that workshop into a phase 1 engagement summary, and that is accessible on the project website. That also includes some summaries of other engagement activities that we had for that first phase. And then we've completed the draft baseline report and infrastructure assessment. So that was kind of the first big milestone that it documents all of the existing conditions that relate to a series of topics. And so we completed that. We've held multiple technical advisory group meetings. So we have 2 of those technical advisory groups, one related to land use and development, one related to infrastructure. And we've met with those groups multiple times. We've met with our environmental justice working group. We've met with them on various topics and related to those project milestones. We've had 2 academic task force meetings, and that is with academicians and people from various universities that have studies or have expertise in issues related. Oh, okay. I didn't lose you
Yeah,
guys.
we experienced some technical difficulty, but we've got our
Oh.
crack senior staff to take care of it, all right? And it'll be more, but let's keep on going.
Sure. So we had those 2 academic task force meetings, and then we also had a land use alternatives charrette. So we had stakeholders, the county, people from all of the divisions and expertise all in one room to start thinking about how we're going to start putting together a land use plan, and we'll get into that. But that's kind of the major events and efforts that we've had thus far, that just to touch on what we've been doing. Just a brief little summary of what we heard at the community workshop. So as I mentioned, we gathered input on 7 different topics. You might remember topics for land use, economics and jobs, public services and resources, transportation, infrastructure, environmental justice and social conditions, and environment. And we looked to you all to help inform the existing opportunities and the constraints related to those topics. And that was all wrapped into this baseline report document that you all have been able to see. So some of those major feedback themes that we got from the workshop were local employment and economic improvement. We heard people talking about having specialized education and training. There was a lot of concern about the poor air quality related to dust, agricultural chemicals, et cetera. The limited water supply, existing and future public health concerns. Those were just some of the major themes that we heard. There's a full list of them, and that's all, again, summarized in that Phase 1 engagement summary. And so we also solicited feedback from those technical groups. We solicited feedback from our environmental justice working group and the academic task force. So they all reviewed the baseline report. And then they provided us with lots of feedback and comments. And so we have this long list of comments on that draft baseline report, and we are going through them. We are prioritizing those comments and trying to pick out the ones that relate to this top priority of the land use alternatives. And that's this phase that we're in right now. We'll also look at the comments as they relate to the legitimacy of the final baseline report. So we'll issue a final baseline report that addresses all those comments, and then addressing all the comments that will relate to the programmatic EIR, which will be a later phase. So I'll hand it over to Brian to go over the land use designations part of the presentation.
Sort of like a singing group. I just can't wait to get the microphone. All right, so what is a land use designation? What are we doing here in relationship to this particular area? How many are familiar with the general plan? Handful of you. Well, that's a series of land use. How many are familiar with zoning? A lot more in relationship to it. These are uses, use definitions and zoning that allows you to build something on your property. So the land use designation defines what kind of development you can have on that property. And what it also focuses on where you're going to locate it. We use these in the general plan. Now, this is a specific plan, so it's a step down, but it's the same concept. We use it to manage how properties are built. We use it to manage sprawl. We use it to manage, incompatibility between land uses. Examples of land uses include agriculture, which of course is a land use in the general plan, industrial, commercial, residential, and recreation. These are all land uses. In this plan, we're creating new land uses, and new land uses that relate to renewable energy, ultimately the processing of lithium as a mineral, and then ultimately development of that into a product. We're also looking at other types of uses. The very first use that we came up with is called green industrial. The green industrial, the goal is to look at operations that help with the decarbonizing of the energy industry, i.e. this is really fitting the national policy to address climate change to a degree. The next land use that we identified was manufacturing, because the industrial, green industry, can be more of heavy user type of things. When we look at the existing geothermal plants, that's going to be a little different than a building where you're going to be manufacturing goods. So we've created a manufacturing land use that focuses on downstream assembly of clean energy products. And it allows for managing processing for a wide range of different things. I want to emphasize here, we see this as not just about lithium and battery development on the long term. We think you'll be making cars here. You'll be making a number of other things. You also have a number of different energy sources. So manufacturing is also a land use we've identified. Next is logistics. Now, logistics is a little different from the standpoint that this is goods movement. It's large buildings where we're going to store a wide range of things. And here we're looking at the downstream supply of really the manufactured products you're making. Now, I will say that we also know that there's a number of interests in creating an inland port here. So that's another use that we see, an inland port that will store not just goods from this manufacturing and industrial area, but from other areas around the state, and particularly in association with the Port of Long Beach and the Port of Los Angeles. So we want to make specific things, but has a different use and different need than a manufacturing or green industry. The next identification is the playas and renewable and restoration. We created this because of the expanding playas. I'm going to ask for another question. Everybody know what the playas are? I should get everybody's hand there. I hate to say it, but it's like in a class, you know. Nobody wants to sit in the front and nobody wants to answer the question. But the playas are important, so we've created this that we know that's an area where basically renewable energy wants to operate. We want to basically see geothermal going out in these areas. But at the same time, we need to be looking at uses that also allow for dust retention. We want to see what are you doing inventively and creatively that help us deal with that aspect which affects air quality. So we've created that land use for the playa area. We did create an interim agricultural overlay use. And that's areas that we see as staying in agriculture probably for the next 20, could be 30 years. But we, in essence, are pre-zoning the underlying use. So we did create an interim agriculture, because ultimately we're going to be trying to create a first phase that can move forward in the first 10 years. We also, and this is something new, is we created a community opportunity areas. These are focused around the city of Calipatria and the community of Nyland, in areas that we think maybe there's some other uses that aren't industrial-based, manufacturing-based, that can help those communities. It could be something like recreation, but it could also be something, an association with commercial or some other development sources that can help those communities achieve what they want with this growth in the adjacent areas. Conservation and floodway are two key land uses. So we have identified a number of areas we think need to be conserved. There's already been conservation programs within it. And the other one is the New River and the Alamo, and looking at that and how we can limit any development in those areas, focusing on preserving, restoration, and things of that nature. One of the other uses that we've been identifying is industrial transportation and rail hub. Recently, in talking with the railroad representatives, they said, look, we don't want to see industrial rail mixed with public rail. So we're now looking at trying to create two different hubs in relationship to that. When I say public rail, we want to basically create some sort of system for the public, both from the standpoint of within the site, how you move around, but also how you connect with where people live. And that if this is a futuristic development of an employment center, we need to be thinking bigger of how people get to work. We need to think people, so it's not just driving cars. So we are looking at these bigger aspects. And then we have the employees in an area. We need to create a commercial hub. So we've identified a couple of locations for a commercial hub. It may involve hotels. It may involve some sundry commercial that employees of the area can use. So we've identified a few locations as it relates to uses that the everyday group has to be. Now I want to emphasize, we're planning not just for the next 5 years, we're planning for 50 years. So we want a plan that's visionary, and that's extremely important. Hard part is looking at together and where you put them on the map and how they relate. So here a series of different alternatives to designate, as I said, 30 to 50 years of development. They should be aligned with a vision. You'll see we prepared a couple of different, with 3 specifically, visions for the property. We want your input on what the vision of development should be. That's one of the things we're trying to get out of today. We also want the alternatives to be influenced by the potential adverse environmental effects. We want to try to minimize or eliminate environmental impacts. And then we also have to understand the water issue. We have to make sure that we're building with what water we can use and how much water that is. So that's something also that factors into this clearly. These are the 3 alternatives. Now to go through what we've come up with, I'm going to turn it back to Shannon. Oh, she's going to give me one more slide. One of the things we did in relation to looking at the alternatives is we focus on, yes, the environmental facts. We also were looking at the economic benefits. We're looking at the jobs created, the community benefit funds raised. We're looking at land consumption. We identify water consumption as one of the issues we need further exploration on. We haven't done the technical studies to look at these in detail yet, but we're working on them. We're looking at the proximity to the environmental justice communities, and then we're looking at the ability to address community needs. One of the things I didn't mention, because I focus on land use, but transportation. We're looking at corridors. How does this really address, basically your street corridors, your highway corridors, and the rail corridor? And that's another important part. Now I get to turn it over to Shannon. Thank you.
Okay, talked about we've talked about nations are that we are considering, and we've talked about how to compare those land use alternatives, the land use alternatives being those maps of compiled land use designations. So we've talked about what those land use alternatives are, the designations, how we compare them. Now, how did we create these land use alternatives? It came with a series of we looked at areas to avoid. So these areas that you see here that are striped out, that includes some existing solar facilities. It includes conservation easements, state lands, basically areas that we don't want to touch that will remain the same. So that way we can plan around them. That's kind of our area to play with. And then we looked at the existing geothermal facilities that are out there, because that's kind of one of the main focuses. So where are all these facilities? They seem to be clustered. That's where we will want to center future development. And then we'd also wanted to look at what are the potential major corridors that can really frame up our land use alternatives. So in looking at those 3 things and having lots of discussions with stakeholders, thinking about our potential project visions, all of that has led us to these 3 different land use alternatives, and I'll go through them. I'll go through them by the colors that you see here on land use alternative 1. So you'll see, starting from the west, you'll see this yellow color, and that's the Playa Renewables and Restoration. And you'll see that there's a solid yellow and there's a striped yellow. So the solid yellow is sort of this initial first phase, if you will, where we want to focus the first few decades of development. The striped is sort of a phase 2, which is long-term. As the playas recede, potentially long-term, we can designate that area as Playas Renewables and Restoration. So working to the east, you'll see this dark green area, and those are conservation areas. Those are a lot of those no-go areas to avoid, so conservation easements, state lands, lands that are protected adjacent to the Salton Sea. And then working a little more west, you see that brown area, and that's the green industrial. It aligns with a lot of those existing geothermal facilities. So you'll see the brown is covering those existing facilities and some potential future facilities. So really trying to focus that first phase of green industrial within those brown areas. And then working to the east a little more, you'll see the purple. And the purple is the manufacturing. So that's, where products will be manufactured, potentially coming from the green industrial. And again, the purple, the solid purple is the first phase where we want to focus the first round or so, first couple decades of development, and then extending to the north there is the phase 2 manufacturing. And then you'll see a strip of pink, and that's the logistics. So that's in between State Route 111 and the rail line. That's just abounding the eastern boundary. And then we have the interim agricultural overlay, and that's in that yellow and green striped area that's within the southwestern kind of vicinity that goes down to the New River and surrounds the Alamo River. That's sort of that held space that we want to retain as agriculture, and as the market and industry demands for more land, we can sort of make that process a little bit more streamlined through this interim agricultural use. And then the light green is renewable energy, and those are existing solar facilities that we want to retain, keep as that use. And then the turquoise there is the community opportunity areas, and we wanted to keep those nearby the existing communities of Nyland and Calipatria. And just a breakdown of the land use alternative number 1, so you'll see the majority, or I guess the larger quantity of land use designation is the playas, renewables, and restoration, followed by the agricultural overlay, manufacturing, and green industrial. So those are kind of the main 4. And then looking at some of the differentiating metrics. So we took a very draft first pass at quantifying how many jobs and how much developed building space could occur if this whole land use plan were to be developed and built out. So looking at the acreages of all of these land uses, looking at how much building space could occur, making assumptions of lot coverage, so how much of the area could actually be developed, how much building space that would occur, and then looking at, based on the number of building square footage, we can make some estimates on how many jobs that could create. So took a very first pass at quantifying that. So again, this is kind of worst case if everything were to be developed long term, potentially in this alternative, 34 to 57,000 jobs, 339 million square feet of building space, which is the equivalent to 7,800 acres of building space. So that's the first alternative. And now I will switch over to the second alternative. So there's not an incredible difference, but you'll notice a few changes here. So the green industrial area is a bit larger. It extends further to the south. The northern area, which used to be phase 2 manufacturing, is now phase 2 logistics. So this this alternative has a higher proportion of logistics, whereas alternative 1 had a higher quantity of manufacturing. So that's another difference. One thing that I forgot in the first alternative is that there's a rail spur included. So we've identified that goes along English Road from north to south, and it ends with a transportation hub at the intersection of English Road and Sinclair. And then in land use alternative 2, we've provided a proposed rail spur that goes along Sinclair Road, which is more of an east-west corridor. So it comes off of the rail and headed in an east-west orientation with a similar location for a transportation at that terminus there. So that's another difference. We'll have in this alternative two commercial hubs, one closest to Nyland and one closest to Calipatria. And in land use alternative 2, the top 4 land use designations are Playas Renewables and Restoration, Green Industrial, which is a higher one than land use alternative 1, Agricultural Overlay, Conservation, and then Logistics is 5th. So it's a higher percentage than land use alternative 1. So looking at the draft metrics of land use alternative 2, it could potentially provide 56 to 93,000 jobs and 363 million square feet of building space, which is the equivalent to about 8,300 acres. So a bit more than land use alternative 1. And that's mainly because of that more logistics space. So looking at land use alternative 3, I think right off the bat, you see a lot more striping, so there's a lot more area that's designated for that longer term phase 2. You'll also notice there's no interim agricultural overlay. So that sort of southern, southwest portion is not interim agricultural. It's designated for industrial or it's designated as manufacturing. So that's just a little bit of a difference there. It's essentially saving that land for specifically green industrial and specifically manufacturing. In alternative 3, the rail spur again goes along Sinclair in an east-west orientation. There's logistics within that northern area. That's kind of a mix of phase 1 and phase 2. So they can utilize State Route 111 there. And then I think those are kind of the major differences. In land use alternative 3, the major land use designation is green industrial, so that's a big difference there. And then followed by manufacturing, Playas Renewables and Restoration, Conservation, and Logistics. So here we have the potential for 57 to 95,000 jobs if everything were to be built out. 502 million square feet of building space, which is the equivalent to 11,500 acres, so it's a bigger jump, and that's, I believe, because there's more manufacturing, and those have larger buildings, and more logistics, because manufacturing logistics have higher quantities of jobs allocated. So just to give you some context, here are the 3 alternatives side by side so you can kind of see the differences there. And we have a station in the back that has all 3 of these lined up so you can take a closer look, see the differences, provide comments on that. So to look at the proportions of those, here we have the 3 alternatives side by side. You'll notice in the first alternative, there's a higher percentage of manufacturing. The second alternative, there's a higher percentage of logistics. And in the third alternative, there's the highest percentage of green industrial. So those are kind of the main differences. If you wanted to know the exact acreages of these, we have these here. Some things to note. For the community opportunity areas, you'll see it's a relatively small percentage. The acreages of those range from 522 acres to 955 acres, just for some context there. So I know that was a lot. We will be going into an open house section or session of the night after we do some Q&A. So I just wanted to introduce the different stations that we'll have in the open house. So we'll have about two, some of them have 3 different land use designations at each station. And within each station and land use designation, we want to get to know what you guys are thinking. If it's a land use designation that seems agreeable and seems appropriate for this area. We want to hear that. We want to hear if you have any other ideas for what types of land uses could be included in those designations. And there's a couple other engagement questions along with those land use designations that will be related to each of those. So those stations are green industrial and renewable energy, so you can look at those more closely together. A second station for manufacturing and logistics in the transportation hub, so you can take a look at those three together. Playas, renewables and restoration, and conservation, see the relationship there. The community opportunity areas, we want to hear from you all of what types of community opportunities that you want to see within those areas that are closest to Calipatria and Nyland. And then also the interim agricultural overlay there, those are paired together. The land use alternative station has those three land use alternatives side by side, so you guys can provide some feedback on those. If there's ones that you prefer, if you'd like to see different elements in different places, we'd love to hear that. Highly recommend you all grabbing sticky notes and writing down your notes and placing them on the exhibits. We'll have facilitators also taking notes of what you're saying and writing them on the sticky notes. We just want to make sure we document everything and get everyone's comments validated and considered. And then lastly, we'll have a project vision statement, and that has 3 different draft project vision statements of kind of various formats and different flavors. So read through those, provide your input. If there's things that we're missing in that vision statement that we want to hear in that statement, please provide that input. Am I missing anything on the open house? Okay. So then we will transition to questions for about 20 minutes or so. And if anyone has a question, please line up here. We have a microphone here. And we will be doing that for about 20 minutes before we break into the open house.
Just make sure I get heard here in the things. Again, I want to emphasize this is about getting your input on what we're proposing, both from the land use standpoint, those designations. We want to hear your thoughts. 2, on how we organize them on the map to create a land use plan, and transportation issues. It's all about those types of things. What I'd like to do now is have speakers come up. If the first speaker would like to raise their hand, if anybody wants to say anything. All right, we'll start with you. Please come up to the mic so you can hold the mic, because ultimately everything's being recorded.
Am I on?
It should be on, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What popped into my mind was in this area that's proposed to be developed, have you done an analysis of what % of this land is private lands and what % is public lands, and which public entities own what percentage of those lands? I'd like to have that information.
We did look at all land ownership, and I don't have those details with me right now, but Shannon?
I don't have exact details on me at this moment, but we have looked at all of the ownership within the specific plan area. That actually helped kind of guide our boundary. We looked at, what ownerships do we not have control over, so we took out some areas of state lands. And then in relation,
Yeah, I want to emphasize also that we have a land use advisory committee where we brought some of the landowners in relationship. IID has a large portion of the land. IID has actually made some agreements with certain owners out there that now, and I'm not sure if it's a long-term lease or they're actually purchasing the property. So there's some transactions going on. And then we know that there's a lot in the southern portion that are all privately owned. But we actually can get you that number because we have the GIS data for all that information. And I just don't have it with me right now, but we'll gladly get it to you.
we've also pulled all of the parcel data, so every parcel in the specific plan boundary. We've gotten all of the owners of every parcel and the address, and we intend to notify them of our process here and notify them of the potential of these different land use designations, so they should be well aware of that.
if I could, when you step up, would you identify yourself and your name and your interests?
What was that last part? My interest or my question? Oh. My name is Fernanda Vega. I'm with Comité Cívico del Valle, and I have two questions. I'm not too sure if I caught it during the presentation, but I don't know what the logistics part was. I don't know if I missed it.
The definition of logistics is a land use where the primary emphasis is storing manufactured goods that will be then distributed throughout the state of California and the United States. So ultimately, if you've been to Moreno Valley, you can see areas up there that are logistics centers, actually in the southern riverside. And that's a use that we know there's a desire to create that. But it's not like manufacturing. It's not building something. It's actually storing and transitioning. Amazon has a lot of logistics spaces throughout the United States. So that's what logistics is.
Perfect, thank you. And the other one was about transportation. Is the initial goal just to have transportation within the Imperial County and end it, let's say, at the end of Bombay Beach, or I don't know where else it's trying to extend and end it in Calexico? Or is it something that you all are planning to extend past Imperial County towards other states perhaps?
I guess I could use some clarification on the question. When you say transportation extent, are you talking about like public transportation or just like transportation improvements?
So the railroad that you had mentioned, there's those black lines in the land use maps. I'm wondering if it's only within the Imperial County that they will be established, or will it go past Imperial County?
Let me pull up that map.
I can start that answer. So we have, number one, is we are looking at improvements to the rail system as it relates to this property. And then as it will distribute out to, that's why we're talking to the railroad, ultimately the distribution system will be all over the United States. So it has to ultimately get to Los Angeles and then ultimately the far northwest to the Midwest to the east. For the employee aspect, we're looking at trying to create a transportation system, or at least from a policy perspective. It won't happen right away, but that we have programs in there that has the internal connection and then goes in some fashion either through bus system, working with Imperial Valley Transit to look at a bus system that goes to where the employees will be. Because one of the goals of this will to be a long-term sustainable development that doesn't substantially add to air quality. So that is part of the programming that we're looking at. And that could go to Calexico, it could go to Ocotillo, depending on where the employees are. This is a good time. The plan at this time does not include housing. So at this stage, it only includes really employment centers. And we're looking at the housing being taken up by the neighboring cities and or the existing cities in other areas. Does that answer your question?
I also kind of wanted to add if it was, I don't know if you mentioned that it was also going to be public, or was it just for the employee aspect of it?
Yeah, let me clarify that. So we had this industrial transportation and rail hub designation, and then kind of separately we've had this thought of having a public transportation hub. So two separate because they're not very compatible. One related to public transportation, one related to commercial, industrial exchange of goods. So kind of separating those two terms of transportation. And then as it relates to leaving the study area or leaving the Imperial County, oh, I went the wrong way. So the specific plan can provide recommendations for improved transportation infrastructure as it relates to the transportation network within the specific plan. So we'll identify certain corridors that might need to be improved for the specific plan. That kind of constrains our scope as it relates to the specific plan area. That would be a discussion with SCAG to implement any external or improvements that might need to occur outside of the specific plan area. So we're in discussions with SCAG as it relates to the broader county and the broader region.
So right now it's just focused on the north end, obviously. Yeah, sorry. Thank you.
Hello, Mark. and this is where I had my teaching 60s.
He's going to help you with the mic again.
Okay.
He's talking about the apprentice project.
Yeah, it's a pre-apprenticeship program. We've been doing it since 1998. We did something in Chicago where we were refurbishing houses that looked a little bit like nylon. You know, they were in Inglewood. It was a different deal. They maybe had 2 of the 4 sides of the original house. Sometimes in nylon, there's just the 4 by 4s. But we would like to see if and I've asked some Board of Supervisors, if there's any way we could identify the owners of that dilapidated area of nylon. I know part of nylon's a part of Calipatria, and they have their houses look just fine, and it's a beautiful school. So I don't know if that's true. Has there been any research done? Because what we would do is ask them to donate those houses to the Heartland Coalition. I'm president and CEO of the Heartland Coalition. We form win-win partnerships that generate good jobs, capable employees, and sustainable communities in relation to the environment, the economy, and the local culture. We have a hard time finding, we can do that though, we can look up each parcel, but if anybody by chance has done that, we would like to offer cleanup of that area and maybe bring in a SIP, a structurally insulated panel. We've been studying those panels for 25 years. There's a group, the 3D group in Mexicali, that could be very good, but there's also some simpler designs that would allow students, like their second day of class, to take an electric drill and drill these panels into a structure, and they could pretend they were carpenters. It'd build confidence, even though they wouldn't build a frame houses at that time. So we have a huge interest in that, and I would like to know if any efforts have been made to look at the infrastructure grants that are available, are starting to be available. Ventura has done some. We have a large grant in Riverside, and some people, I talked to some people in Brawley, they thought, well, we'd rather do agriculture, but these infrastructure grants aren't focused on that. So that's just a question.
I would say yes, the county is very in tune with what types of grants are coming down the pipeline and what we can use to our advantage for this particular project and any other infrastructure improvements in the county. I don't particularly have details on what grants we are looking for this particular project.
Yeah, I want to be straightforward that we haven't quite gotten to the housing element yet. And as I said, since this project wasn't having housing, infrastructure as it relates to sewer, water, fire, sheriffs, all of that is one of the things we're looking at. It's a great question, and by the way, this is where I also say the people that will be stationed at that includes a number of county staff people from both the Public Works Department and from the Planning Department. So they're individuals that we can carry this, but that's a great question. And
We're working on those grants in Utah. We're also approved in every county in California, so Heartland would be happy to be a partner in that kind of endeavor. I think everything that you've done here would tie right into the background research on that. And I'm guessing, I don't know if you've applied for any money from, well, there's HUD, but there's also loans from the USDA. They're not grants, but they're sure nice loans, long-term, low interest. And that's probably all you should say. I still teach, and I'm on the faculty at USC on nonprofit management, and I talk way too much because the students that I'm giving grades to all pretend to be interested. So I apologize for my long-winded discussion.
We appreciate the question. I will tell you, by the way, we also are working in partnership with San Diego State University and IVC, who also are developing training programs to put people to work from the community into these facilities.
I did write some books. One of them was on using personal journal entries to generate academic and creative writing, and it still sells. And in 1985, the book I did on cross-disciplinary writing, we presented to the faculty of IVC, And my first time here, I played a baseball game at Mexicali. Couldn't believe how large the town was. I was on a White Sox farm team, and Minnie Minoso and Warren Spann were on the other team. They didn't have a lot of money then, so they played in Mexicali. So that was an exciting introduction to the Imperial Valley. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We have our next speaker here coming up.
Hello. Always a pleasure to go after Mark. Eric Reyes, lifelong resident, always been involved in these issues, and just a number of questions. Yeah, baseball player also, that's why Mark and I get along. First of all, seeing the history of our community and how it's been slow to develop, and the industry that is coming in and the difficulties, say the labor union contractors have had of getting them to discuss how to get PLAs or local hire provisions in it, how much are they putting into this development? Because Nyland and the area, we're working on a housing project and we're having a heck of a problem with infrastructure. How are we going to be able to have a world-class level infrastructure if the industry itself is now also being part of the whole community development?
Well, I'll start with the fact that the union has been represented at almost every one of our meetings in relationship to coming about. So we know of the interest of the unions and of that. A number of these jobs, they come across a wide range of different, so if you talk about manufacturing, that may be a different union than, let's say, logistics or something of that nature. The specific plan itself won't deal with it. That's not the kind of policy a specific plan will deal with. That's something the Board of Supervisors would deal with on a other basis. So ultimately, but at the same time, what the specific plan will do is create land uses, hopefully, that will create the opportunity for the unions to ultimately have a certain type. And that's not just in the jobs that could be in the manufacturing industry or the logistics industry or the green industrial industry, but it also is in the construction of these buildings. So ultimately there. And that'll be something that's worked out between various citizens, the unions, and the Board of Supervisors.
Yeah, but the basic question is, how much is industry going to be involved at the plate? You're looking at grants, you want grants from HUD, you want grants from so-and-so. How much is industry going to be at the plate for that infrastructure? You can't put the cart before the wheel, right?
No, that's a great question, because ultimately one of the things we showed you, we started with looking at the whole 50,000 acres, which is actually 51,000. So we're looking at maximum development. Both Shannon and I have been sitting back and then talking with staff is that it's way too much in relationship to absorption. So it all has to be dialed down and brought in. So the immediate number of jobs for the first 10 years is going to be a much smaller number. And also we want to try to make sure that it's sized. Now in relationship to, if we create a process to allow, and let's use CTR, which is one of the applicants that we've seen, and they say they have a specific program for lithium extraction, development, and actually battery construction. There would have to some tie-in in relationship to that industry or some fashion towards making the improvements to the infrastructure required to make that project happen. And I'm pretty sure that will be part of the overall element of the specific plan in relation to a phasing project for infrastructure.
That's not part of the land use recommendation at this time, or is that at the end?
Not at this time, but it will be the next phase in relation. Once we determine what land use and how many acres we're actually going to build, then we start looking at how big is the sewer plant? How big are the roads? And so looking at those things. We are trying to identify, and we want your input on, do we choose the right roads? We haven't started locating the sewer plant because we want to make sure we get the land use designation. Where does manufacturing go? Where does the green industry go? Although we know for the most part the green industry is going to go right near the geothermal plants. We are talking to a green hydrogen plant that wants to come in. Where should that go? Are there conflicts between that land use and something else? We know where the logistics wants to go. They want to be by the highway and by the rail. So these are the things we're wrestling today. But the next stage will be, once we whittle it down and make sure we're in the right location, let's look at the infrastructure for that and what we need.
And is the land use, at this point, are you identifying then the environmental impacts and mitigation needed, or is that into the next phase as well?
That's the next phase. So once we get your input and we start finalizing, like we're interested right now tonight, do you like the land uses? Do you think they're a good idea? Do you think the direction we're moving? Once we get that down, then we come to what we call a preferred alternative. And then that has to start being the environmental analysis. And I keep on taking the phone away from my partner, so I'm going to give it to her.
I just wanted to make a couple quick notes on that. On your second question, maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but as of now, a lot of these applicants have been providing that needed infrastructure themselves. So the purpose or a part of the specific plan will include an infrastructure section that will provide recommendations for where we think future infrastructure improvements will be needed, and creating a sort of system that makes it far easier for these developers to come in and not have to bear all of that burden themselves. Maybe there's some sort of system or agreement that makes it a little bit more focused and streamlined for infrastructure improvements.
Thank you.
Betty Miller. Hello?
We can hear you.
I know that some battery manufacturers have made commitments with coming down and building factories and stuff. Do they have to wait for you to finish this land use plant, or can they procure land and start doing design and what's necessary for them to get started?
I would say they can. It will just be easier and more streamlined once we have completed the specific plan. So they could come through and go through the whole process individually.
Right now, if they try to come forward, they would then have to do a separate plan and a separate environmental impact report. So the whole reason for this to move forward is to try to streamline the system. But they could come out and negotiate. And actually, there is one that has talked to Jim Minnick in relationship to saying, oh, well, okay, maybe I can't go there right now. Maybe look at Mesquite. So there are issues, and that's the emphasis of moving forward. We are talking, and so one of the things that Shannon did, and maybe I'll turn it to her to talk to a little bit about, a lot of the numbers and things we came up with is looking at the different industries we talked to, including battery manufacturers and others. So why don't you talk a little bit about those groups that you studied to build your analysis?
Well, to get that draft set of metrics to compare the land use alternatives, we had the number of jobs and number of building space. We had to look at a bunch of different case studies, so case studies around the country, around the world, ones that we can find in the specific plan area in the county, and basically pulling the numbers from those that we can recreate and base our assumptions off of. So looking at manufacturing plants that manufacture batteries for Panasonic in, I believe, Tennessee or some place over there, and seeing the square footage there and the number of jobs there, and that gets built into our assumptions.
We also looked at Ford, a number of different, all those uses. But go ahead, sir.
Salvador Abrica, Teamsters Local 542. So on all three of the options that you presented, you have different numbers for the jobs, the potential jobs, right? I mean, they're projections, but I think it would be a wise thing to do is to separate or split those up by saying which ones are being temporary jobs, because during the construction, we're gonna have a certain amount of jobs, and then those may be local hire, may not be local hire, but then what are the permanent jobs that will remain, projected permanent jobs? Because when you talk to the community here in the Valley, you mentioned jobs, that's great, you know, especially if they're going to be good paying jobs, you know, benefits and everything else included potentially. But at the end of the day, it's what kind of job or workforce is going to be required in that long term. You're saying 50 years. Well, it doesn't take 50 years to build a building. So those 200 to 300 workers are going to come, build a building and move on, maybe come back later, cycle back through for the next facility. But I think it would be fair that you separate that and that the community understands what will be here for the long term, not the short term of the buildup.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that comment. That's a great question, and that's something that we've thought about and we're working towards. We're still very much in the middle of this land use alternatives phase. We wanted to stop in the middle and get a lot of the input from the community and the stakeholders, but we have been looking into that, and that's something that we're looking at in those case studies. So for all of these different projects that we've seen, looking at how many construction workers, how many blue-collar, white-collar jobs. So it's just in this data collection phase where we need to find that data for each of those projects that we can build in those assumptions to then create sort of this master spreadsheet of all of the phase 1 acres, phase 1 jobs, And within those jobs, how many do we expect from logistics, manufacturing, and within those jobs are those construction and long-term jobs, white collar, blue collar. So we're definitely looking into that. We just need to continue to build up our case studies.
And we're going to change that thing from white collar, blue collar. I know that's in some of the studies, because ultimately the goal is to really try to bring good jobs across the board.
Thank you.
Hello. My name is Miguel Zavala from SDSU Imperial Valley. Question is regarding on the change of land use of the three alternatives. I noticed that the south part of it takes some of the current. Wondering why, as opposed to expand towards the north, towards current land use that is not used for agriculture. I'm just considering the jobs that are lost from the agricultural sector because of the
land uses in the south. The land uses in the south were chosen for the interim agricultural area because they fall under a classification of prime agricultural lands. And so that's one of the reasons we chose it. But that's why we're also here to see if you think we should change it to get your input. But we did take a specific rationale of where are the prime agricultural lands, which the state of California is asking us to preserve. So that was the rationale. And as you notice, we look at east, a major phase is going to be really more east-west driven because it's connecting to the rail. But we also have an alternative that's north-south driven, but the southern portion is a little different.
So you mentioned the difference between these alternatives where alternative 1 and 2 have that interim agricultural overlay and alternative 3 does not. So what we would have to do, and this is kind of in the later phases of this project where we start looking at the differences of the existing versus proposed metrics in terms of people and jobs and all sorts of metrics and consumption. That is one thing that we would have to look at. So how many existing jobs are out there, and then how many jobs are proposed, and what is that difference, what is that delta, and that would be then analyzed as part of the environmental impact report.
I'm going to ask that we make this the last question so we can really get together with you at the sites. So,
well, that sounds great because I got the most important question. My name is Corbin Dillon. I'm with the Heartland Coalition. I'm actually the Imperial Valley coordinator and director here. So my job is to actually get people certified so they're ready for the job force. But my biggest question is what you guys is thinking on actually hiring local, because I know that we have a lot of people here locally that are unemployed or low income. And my advocacy is actually to be able to kind of hire locally first and try to get them the schooling or whatever the task or craft that they need in order for them to be of service for your company.
That's a great question, and I want to emphasize all of the direction we have from the county, and what the emphasis of this is to create a job center, ultimately an employment center that's going to service the Imperial County first, citizens of the Imperial County, and that's one of the reasons we're also seeing a lot of investment going into programs at IVC, Imperial Valley College, and San Diego State University. So that is going to be the highest priority, not just in the plan that we create, but also from the Board of Supervisors. And I want to emphasize there's a lot of county staff here. What I'd like to do now is ask you all to go to stations so you can talk to us individually and find the thing that you're most interested in getting involved with and working in that and putting your notes out. And then we'll close out. That gives us about, 45 minutes? 45 minutes. Thank you all for coming, and please stay.